Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. Creation of a demilitarized free economic zone in the Donbas and acceleration of Ukraine's EU accession by January 1st, 2027. These are some of the points of a revised peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. But are these plans feasible? Well, we'll have more on that for you later. But first, a look at more of today's top stories. US Envoy John Coale joins Belarusian President Aleksander Lukashenko in Minsk for talks on the release of political prisoners. The Czech Republic's new Prime Minister says he will not be joining Slovakia's Fico and Hungary's Orbán in blocking EU policies. And Poland gears up for the construction of its first nuclear power plant. As a result of the latest peace plan, what will happen to the partially occupied Ukrainian territories of the Donbas? US President Trump, who has been pushing Ukraine to strike a deal with Russia, is now proposing the creation of a demilitarized free economic zone in the Donbas. On top of that, the Financial Times reported a new point from the plan securing Ukraine's EU accession by January 1st, 2027. For more on the latest regarding the peace plan and how it may affect Ukraine, defense correspondent Zuzanna Jurek reports.
Though Ukrainians continue withstanding Russia's relentless attacks, their faces are starting to betray a level of resignation, particularly as the US continues to pressure Kyiv to yield to Russian demands on one of the two biggest unknowns of potential peace plans, Ukrainian territory.
Well, I think Kyiv is in a position where they have to navigate their relations with the Trump administration. They certainly don't want to be perceived in Washington and by Trump in particular as an obstacle to peace.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the US has now proposed that the Ukrainian-controlled, heavily fortified Donbas region, where Russia makes inch-worthy territorial gains but has failed to capture, is to be set up as a demilitarized so-called free economic zone. But with Kremlin's insistence that Ukrainian troops withdraw, one key question remains.
President Zelensky said something that, okay, if there is a demilitarized zone from which we are supposed to withdraw our troops and Moscow is not supposed to move their troops in, then who's responsible for managing this piece of land? And says the Americans have not explained that yet. So I think that's an open question, but that certainly is a vulnerability for Ukraine.
But as Zelensky urges resilience at the front lines,
it is extremely important to achieve results on the front line so that Ukraine can achieve results in diplomacy. That's how it works. Our strong military positions within the country equal strong positions in talks about ending the war.
The US remains reserved in its potential commitments to Ukraine, while experts note that alternatives are limited.
The only country that could actually provide a Article 5 type guarantee is the US. The EU currently doesn't have the capacity to deliver the same amount of deterrence as the US is.
At the same time, the EU is throwing its towel into the ring, presenting Washington with a draft peace plan which envisages that Ukraine could join the bloc as early as January 2027.
It's the European leaders dangling this EU membership, this fast track to EU membership, as a sweetener for Zelensky and for the Ukrainian people to accept what President Stubb referred to as not necessarily just peace.
For his part, Zelensky is also willing to make a nod towards US demands, saying that territorial concessions are to be decided via a democratic vote. But, as the former US ambassador to Ukraine pointed out, constant shelling of Ukrainian cities makes the logistics of conducting referendums or elections tricky.
The election would be a form of referendum on any kind of a peace deal. However, it is, as you just pointed out, it's impossible to have an election, a referendum, while the Russians are bombing Ukrainian cities.
But while public support in Ukraine for territorial concessions has climbed to almost 40%, that does not appear to be the case for Ukrainian freedom fighters at the front lines.
We can't just leave parts of our territory. How could it be? Let's say my house is somewhere near Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, or Sloviansk. Should I just leave my parents, everything, and just go? I don't think so. Better to fight and be free than to be enslaved.
And as diplomatic pressure mounts on Ukraine to give in, Experts remind current draft proposals are likely to only result in temporary peace.
Russia views this as a success. They will announce it as a success. And in case they see that as a success, I don't think that in like 5-10 years' time, anything would stop them to actually continue.
And as diplomacy becomes more complicated, the coalition of the willing is poised to meet again this weekend. The US's attendance, however, remains under a question mark. For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
And according to emerging reports, following the coalition of the willing meeting over the weekend, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will travel to Berlin to discuss the latest on the peace negotiations with European and NATO allies. And we continue. Friday saw talks held between U.S. envoy John Coale and Belarusian President Aleksander Lukashenko. President Donald Trump tasked Coale with negotiating the release of political prisoners in Belarus. According to unofficial reports, there could be around 150 prisoners considered for release. Poles are especially hopeful for the release of Polish-Belarusian journalist and activist Andrzej Poczobut, who was imprisoned 4 years ago. Our reporter Kazimierz Łysiak is on standby at the Polish-Belarusian border. He joins me now to share the latest. Good evening, Kazimierz. So talk us through these negotiations, and when can we expect more concrete information on these political prisoners?
Good evening, Claudia. We are indeed here at one of the border crossings between Poland and Belarus, hoping that soon some of these political prisoners will go through here to Poland. But for now, we are dealing with a lot of unknowns. We know that the US delegation led by John Coale has arrived to Minsk today, and these talks will likely continue until tomorrow, until Saturday. So we are sure to know more probably in the next 24 hours. However, we are dealing with a lot of unknowns and unofficial reports from various sources. I've spoken with some of our colleagues from Bielsat TV, from the Belarusian channel of TVP, and they told me that even if a certain name appears on the potential list of released political prisoners, it does not necessarily have to mean that they will be released in the end by the Belarusian regime. Of course, everyone here in Poland is eagerly waiting for the release of Andrzej Poczobut, leading activist in Belarus who has been behind bars for the past 4 years. But will he be among those released? We don't know. We don't even know if the number 150 is accurate. We just have to wait and see. Interestingly, we've seen a video of a brief interaction between the US envoy, John Coale, and the self-proclaimed leader of Belarus, Aleksander Lukashenko. In this interaction, the self-proclaimed president, can be heard praising US President Donald Trump, what we can only assume is about his recent attitudes towards the peace in Ukraine, saying that Russia has the upper hand in the conflict, and also his criticisms towards Europe. Let's take a look at this brief interaction.
I congratulate you with the new appointment. You're currently our top official on Belarus. Tell Trump that we must do something about this, and we will. They say Trump loves flattery, but I'm not doing it for the sake of flattery. I want to say that I really like his actions lately. We have many questions. The world is changing very quickly, and new problems are emerging that we need to discuss, and perhaps even resolve some of them.
While we see a warming of relations between the United States and Russia and Belarus, which is often called a de facto puppet state of Russia, the regime of Alexander Lukashenko seems to have no objections in increasing its hybrid war waged against partners and allies of the United States, like Poland, for example. Since 2021, we've seen waves of illegal migrants, mostly from the Middle East, being forced by the Belarusian regime to the borders with Poland. This has been a major bone of contention between Warsaw and Minsk, and just on Thursday we've seen some 200 migrants digging a tunnel underneath the border fence between Poland and Belarus and then spreading in the country. Most of them were caught by the Polish border guard, but as I spoke with one of the officers of the Polish border guard, this really is showing that the Belarusian regime is also helping these migrants in crossing the border. They couldn't have done it on their own.
Let's remember that all people who are found on the Belarusian side of the border are there only with the consent and knowledge of Belarusian services. The Belarusian services have their own so-called systems, meaning their own fencing, through which no one can pass without their permission and knowledge. What's more, this tunnel was a really professional job. To build it, you need tools, and someone has to provide those tools. I don't believe someone, let's say from Afghanistan, is traveling with those kinds of tools.
It's actions such as these which are making Warsaw and other European countries doubtful of the intentions of the Belarusian regime. Let me remind you, there are still more than 1,300 political prisoners behind bars in Belarus. Hopefully you will see some of them released quite soon. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you very much, Kazimierz. That was Kazimierz Łysiak reporting live from Bobrowniki border crossing in Poland. And we continue. Refusal to spread Russian propaganda. This is their crime. Droves of Ukrainian journalists remain detained after their capture in occupied territories, with many blood-curdling stories of mistreatment and downright torture surfacing as the war continues. Anastasia Yanchenko spoke to journalist Dmytro about his own captivity, detailing Russia's horrific crimes against independent journalists.
Hunger, total hunger, cold. They beat us with rubber batons. They used a stun gun on us.
That is how Dmytro, a former Russian prisoner, describes what Ukrainian journalists endure in Russian captivity. Dmytro spent 3 years in a Russian prison where he was taken in March 2022. In August 2025, he was released in a prisoner of war exchange between Russia and Ukraine. A brutal crackdown in Russia has made the country the world's leading jailer of foreign journalists. At the moment, 26 Ukrainian journalists remain in Russian captivity, held in complete incommunicado.
They don't have any access sometimes to lawyers. They don't have any access to any medical support. Some of them do not have any contact with their families, and the families do not know where they are located, where they are transferred. They can learn about transfer couple of months after it happened.
All of these journalists were detained in Russian-occupied territories because they refused to spread Russian propaganda. They exposed what life under Russian occupation truly looks like. One of the most widely reported recent cases is that of 21-year-old Yana Suvorova, who was arrested in August 2023 at the age of 19 for administering a pro-Ukrainian Telegram group.
They kept her in a cell with people who had attempted suicide. They were preparing her for a strict regime right there in occupied Donetsk, and her emotional state really deteriorated from there.
Yana was sentenced to 14 years in prison. From Melitopol, she was transferred to Taganrog in Russia, a facility notorious for its horrific conditions. It is the same prison where Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshina was killed.
She was healthy, young journalist, and the body was returned in horrible condition. She lost a lot of weight. The inner organs were removed. Russians were trying to cover the artificial way of how she died.
Roshina's case drew international attention, highlighting violations of the Geneva Conventions. The European Commission has already imposed sanctions on the prison officials responsible for the Ukrainian journalist's death. The number of crimes against journalists continues to grow each month. Since February 2022, 868 crimes against Ukrainian media workers have been recorded. During this time, 119 journalists have been killed, 15 while reporting, 14 others remain missing, and 29 have been kidnapped. To investigate these crimes and bring imprisoned journalists back home, the Ukrainian parliament has established a special investigative commission.
We want to tell more about how propaganda justifies both crimes against media, crimes against humanity, the genocidal intent of this war.
However, Dmytro, who survived 3 horrific years in Russian captivity, says that only applied pressure in Russia can bring freedom to those still in prison.
Everyone must speak out about them holding journalists in captivity. Every international platform must be reminded that they are violating international law and the Geneva Conventions by illegally detaining civilians, including journalists. We need to keep up the pressure so that they release them.
For TVP World, Anastasia Yanchenko.
Continuous discussions on the use of frozen Russian assets seem to have ruffled feathers in Moscow, with Russia's central bank announcing it will sue the company retaining its assets in Brussels. This comes as the European Union agreed on Friday to indefinitely freeze Russian central bank assets held in Europe. Now the question is if and how to use the money to find a loan for Ukraine. Our correspondent Aleksander has the story.
Well, this lawsuit by the Russian Central Bank will be put forward in front of a court in Moscow. They are suing Euroclear, the clearinghouse that holds Russian sovereign assets frozen in the European Union following EU sanctions. Now, of course, that court in Moscow does not have jurisdiction over Euroclear, and European officials have been abundantly clear today, speaking behind the scenes, that all those European sanctions are completely compliant with European and international law, and therefore a Moscow court cannot adjudicate on this and therefore are not being taken that seriously. It is seen by many Brussels officials as just a way of frustrating the process. That is what we heard from Valdis Dombrovskis, the economy commissioner.
We can expect that Russia will continue to launch speculative legal proceedings to prevent the EU from upholding international law and to pursue the legal obligation for Russia to compensate Ukraine for the damages it has caused them.
So Brussels not taking this lawsuit all that seriously. What is serious, however, is the looming battle over the horizon. The European Council meeting of all 27 EU leaders here in Brussels. We had protesters outside of the European Council building in the last few hours calling for Belgium to make Russia pay, to release the funds to pay for a reparations loan to fund Ukraine over the next couple of years. The Belgian Prime Minister is still digging his heels in. He says he does not want to have his country shouldering any potential litigation or financial blowback alone. Nevertheless, many member states want this loan to go through. There is still a lot of pressure on Belgium. If a deal is not reached in the coming week, there may be serious concerns for Ukraine's funding over the next couple of years. In Brussels, I'm Aleksander for TVP World.
Prime Minister of Hungary Viktor Orbán and his Slovakian counterpart Robert Fico have reacted negatively to plans calling for the use of Russia's frozen assets as financial support for Ukraine. However, the Czech Republic's new Prime Minister Andrzej Babiš has remained quiet on the issue. He visited Brussels yesterday, meeting with both the European Commission President and the European Council. Speaking afterwards, Babiš denied claims that he'd be joining the EU's so-called awkward squad and that he will cooperate with each member state equally. Our correspondent in Prague, Andrew Sweeney, has more.
The EU's so-called awkward squad is adamant that frozen Russian assets must not be used to finance Ukraine. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán said the European Commission is raping European law to push the proposal through.
Today, the Brusselians are crossing the Rubicon. The European Commission is systematically raping European law. It is doing this in order to continue the war in Ukraine, a war that clearly isn't winnable.
His Slovak counterpart Robert Fico is equally livid.
If for Western Europe the life of a Russian or Ukrainian is worth shit, I do not want to be part of such a Western Europe. I told A. Costa that I will not support anything, even if I have to sit in Brussels until the new year, which would lead to support for Ukraine's military expenditures.
The Czech Republic's new Prime Minister, Andrzej Babiš, has yet to make his position public. He visited European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa in Brussels on December 11th. During his trip, Babiš also met with Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever, who, Babiš says, outlined his disapproval over using the frozen Russian assets. Yet Babiš is adamant that he carries no associations with the so-called awkward squad. Furthermore, he says it doesn't exist.
The frequent claims by foreign media about a certain problematic club of states is untrue. I will seek allies among all member states.
Babiš said he asked Costa if the Czech Republic could access more funds via the EU's SAFE programme for military spending. He wants more than the nearly €3 billion already allocated to the Czech Republic. Achieving this would require closer cooperation with Brussels.
He can get. He's not going to be Orban too. I think the current government of Czech Republic is essentially going to be very pragmatic about the chances it can get by engaging in different multilateral formats.
Babiš's reputation as a pragmatist, a wily political operator, is under scrutiny at a particularly fraught time for the European Union. Will Babiš end up with the awkward squad and align himself more closely with Donald Trump's vision of the world, or will he forge closer links to Brussels than would have been expected? Between December 12th and December 18th, when he'll travel back to Brussels for a European Council meeting, the first of his second term as Prime Minister, we'll find out more. For TVP World in Prague, Andrew Sweeney.
As Ukraine peace talks enter a decisive phase amid land and democratic disputes, we are learning more about expectations on all sides of the discussion, expectations that are causing concern from both Ukraine and the EU. Joining me on World News Tonight is John Sweet, co-founder of IntRep 360, to shed more light on where the peace deal is headed. Good evening and thank you for joining me on the program.
Hey, good evening, Claudia. Thanks for having me on the show.
Pleasure. So, as we're looking at the latest developments, we heard about the idea of demilitarized zone. Is Ukraine going to agree?
I don't think Ukraine's going to agree. Look, there comes a point in this discussion right now that the sides can't agree, quite frankly, on what the definition of peace is. You know, Russia defines peace as Ukraine stops resisting. Ukraine defines peace as Russia stopping attacking and withdrawing from Ukraine, while the Trump administration defines peace as the two sides not shooting at one another so they can all benefit economically. So no, I personally, I don't think we're going to see a demilitarized zone, not in the near future.
As we're looking at this peace plan, we're looking at the negotiations, high-level negotiations taking place constantly over the past few days and weeks. It is clear that everyone is focusing at a final goal of achieving peace, but there's also the long term that we need to pay attention to. Is the establishment, would the establishment of demilitarized zone not in fact be, in a way, a capitulation of Ukraine when we look at it from a long-term perspective?
Well, it depends on where you draw the line for a demilitarized zone, right? I mean, if the militarized zone is on the west side of the Donbas, then no, it doesn't serve Ukraine's purpose. There's the concept of the demilitarized zone has been successful at times in history. The Korean War is successful, and obviously with the Fulda Gap in Berlin, it has some moderate success too. But it creates a frozen war in which it continues in for a certain amount of time. It could be 5 years, 10 years. But what it does allow during that time in which the forces aren't fighting one another, it allows Russia to reset its military and to put its eyes on that Donbas fortress, which in a sense is the gateway to Kyiv and also Odessa. So it's going to take more than a demilitarized zone. It's going to take serious security guarantees and probably NATO boots on the ground to deter Russia.
The reason I mentioned it is because in 2014 we've seen Crimea. In 2022 we're seeing the Donbas. The question would be what's next. And as we move on, we know that President Zelensky has asked the parliament, the Ukrainian parliament, to be able to move pieces around to see if a potential if potential voting is going to be able to take place in Ukraine, even though the constitution says otherwise. We've heard from President Trump, who is quite outspoken about maintaining democracy in Ukraine and pushed for the elections during the martial law. Do you think that this is a good idea to hold an election considering that there is an ongoing war in Ukraine? How would people be able to vote, especially if they're living on the front line?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. I don't think they can. I mean, first of all, Zelensky has said he's willing to do it, but there'll have to be a ceasefire, and it's going to call for military forces to be there to ensure the ceasefire and to secure a safe environment. Look, there's no reason to believe that Russia's not going to try to interfere in this type of election here. They've done it in Moldova. They've done it in Romania. They've also done it in Georgia. And oh, by the way, they've done it in the United States too. So they will actively try to influence the vote within Ukraine. And by influence the vote, it could be kinetic energy as well. They could target polling stations where known voters for Zelensky or a Ukrainian nationalist as opposed to a Russian nationalist. So no, they will. And history tells us that they're going to interfere. It's just how are they going to interfere?
So we're hearing those calls from President Trump pushing for democracy, for pursuing democracy in Ukraine, for these elections to take place. Why is President Trump not pushing for Russian democracy? I mean, Putin has been the de facto leader of Russia in different capacities since 2000, and none of the recent elections can be actually considered free.
Oh, exactly. I mean, 25 plus years Putin's been in charge and led the government, whether he's actually been the president or behind the president directing traffic. So, yeah, that always seems to fall by the wayside, doesn't it? No, I agree with you. First of all, Zelensky is the legitimate president of Ukraine, so I think we need to start with that.
It's very important to stress that.
He is
Yes.
in combat right. Absolutely, decisively engaged right now with Russia. So for him to realistically think that he's going to pull his forces off of the battlefield in order to secure polling positions, I just don't understand where that thought process comes from. But you're right. Putin has been a leader for 25 years. He's a dictator. He's not an elected dictator. There's no other people that are running against him, okay, and are stuffing ballot boxes, and they own the narrative. So, no, it's not democracy in Russia. It's clearly a dictatorship that's been that way for a while.
So there's been an interesting development. According to the Financial Times article, one of the points in the peace plan would involve Ukraine's EU accession by January 1st, 2027. That proposal was made by both Ukraine and the EU officials. And we've heard from President Zelensky, who on Thursday spoke to journalists in Kyiv, and he said, quote, "If we agree a deal specifying when Ukraine becomes a member of the EU, the Americans, as a party to this agreement, will do everything so that our European path cannot be blocked by others in Europe over whom they have the influence." Do you think that the US president is going to back this idea up, or will perhaps Putin try to play his cards and convince Trump this is a bad idea?
Well, first of all, Putin's already said he has no issue with Ukraine joining the EU. He said that numerous times. But in typical Russian fashion, they say one thing and then they move the goalposts the next day and say something completely. But he has said, and Lavrov has said publicly, that they support the EU's, Ukraine being brought into the EU. It's NATO they have an issue with. Remember, EU doesn't have a military force. It has somewhat of a military force, but it doesn't have a NATO-capable military force. It doesn't have American backing as far as the military. So they've always been okay with that. NATO's where he draws the line. But now, all of a sudden, they don't want him in the EU either. So again, flip-flop, moving goalposts. That's the way the Russians negotiate.
So do you think that a possible EU accession on the 1st of January 2027 could open doors for Ukraine to join NATO?
It could open doors, but they still have to address other issues in joining NATO. And one of those issues, obviously, is the ongoing perception and actuality of corruption within their government. That's always been a sticking point. When they were part of Partnership of Peace, that was the sticking point. You got to undo the corruption. And Ukraine has put measures in place with internal inspection, internal IG inspections and internal audits, and they are catching people who are in part of the corruption, but they have to rid more corruption in order to find a way into NATO.
And what about what we called here on TVP World the awkward squad? How would Fico and Orban actually respond to this prospect of Ukraine joining so fast?
Yeah, well, right now they don't support the EU even supporting Ukraine with any type of monetary assistance, either for humanitarian or military assistance. And they will lean towards the cheap energy that Putin provides them. So if Putin says no, they say no.
But there's always President Trump.
Easy. So there is always President Trump. And President Trump is a big piece of the equation for the Russian side. Right now, I think we're starting to see the Europeans, separate. And that's a forced separation. But yeah, Trump is a big player. And Trump has reached out to Orban for support as far as trying to generate a peace deal, but it still revolves around economic opportunities. So it is a difficult equation and one that's not likely to be solved within the next couple months.
Our time on the program is coming to an end, but just before we go, I wanted to ask you one more question that is incredibly important also for Poland. So we've seen the security strategy, the U.S. security strategy, and we have an idea of what it could mean to Europe. But if an attack on Europe happened, do you think that America would actually come first for the U.S.?
Absolutely. Look, America has 76,000 soldiers that are stationed in Europe right now, and they will be stationed in Europe throughout 2027. The latest bill passed in Congress assures that they'll be there to 2027. The commander of NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, is an American 4-star general. American footprint is there. Rotational forces are in Poland, and they're also in the Baltic states too. So no, the United States will be present, and the United States will live up to its Article 5 agreements.
Thank you very much, John. That was John Sweet, co-founder of Interrupt 360. Thank you so much for joining again.
Hey, thank you, Claudia.
And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more news and features in just a moment.